in the middle of a series throughout the book of Jonah. It's been a really fun series for me. It's been very enlightening, and I hope it's been the same to you. And I hope it's opened your eyes to some of the things that the Old Testament has for us, some of the things that God has for us. Well, I'll do a quick recap to kind of catch us up to speed, and then I'm going to jump right into the text because we've got a lot to talk about tonight. The first week, Phil Owen, my trusted friend and colleague, was here. He talked a lot about how Jonah is about a story of a person who is in control and wants to be in control, wants to remain in control of their life, and how we as followers of the way of Jesus develop through suffering. That's the first thing we started off with. Last week I talked about God's grace to the most unexpected and perhaps the most undeserving people in the story thus far, these sailors who were pagans and believed in a pantheon of gods, and yet Yahweh is the one who extends grace to them and saves them. Very unlikely turn of events in the story. And then tonight, we're going to be in Jonah chapter 2. We're going to cover the whole chapter tonight, and we're going to be just starting at the beginning and going through the end. A couple things I want you to think about tonight, okay? In Jonah chapter 2, we get into the whole whale fish scenario, okay? Which is usually the first thing we hear about Jonah, and the only thing we remember about Jonah, right? So if you remember anything about Jonah from the past times you've heard about it, you're like, oh yeah, that was the guy who was in the fish. I hope that doesn't cause you to check out tonight, like as if you already know the story, you've already got it kind of sorted out and figured out. There's some things in here that I think if we give it a harder look or we dig in just a little bit deeper, we'll actually find some nuanced pieces of this story that might change the way it impacts you a little bit. So I think there's something in here for everybody, and I hope that you don't just check out because you either feel like you have the story somewhat memorized, or maybe you think that this story is sort of fictional fantasy, maybe you think it's fact and history, whatever. People have their different reasons for checking out on a story like this, and I just want to encourage you to stay engaged and involved. We're going to start in Jonah chapter 2, starting in verse 1. It goes like this. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God. He said, "In my distress I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From deep in the realms of the dead, I called for help, and you listened for my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the seas, and the curtains swirled around me. The currents swirled around me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again toward your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me, the deep surrounded me, the seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down, the earth beneath barred me in forever. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and prayed, and that my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. I will say salvation comes from the Lord. And the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto dry land. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I want to start really quickly here with some basic principles of studying the Bible, okay? So the fancy word for this is hermeneutics. This is how you approach the text. This is how you approach the Bible. I think it's really important that you come here on a Sunday night and you grow a little bit. You gain a little bit of information. Maybe you're stretched or challenged or encouraged or what have you. But I also think it's important to teach a person to fish, so to speak, okay? If I can't use a fish, reference when we're in the book of Jonah, then when can I use it, right? So I want you to leave here feeling like you have some tools to take wherever you are and study the text on your own. Because frankly, if this is the only place that you engage these ideas, then it's not really something you can call your own, right? These have to be things that leak into the Monday through Saturday. These have to be the things that you are able to take work with you, to family, friendships, neighborhoods, whatever it is you're a part of. These ideas have to find a way to permeate into the rest of our life. And so I hope that as we go along through books like this, that you learn a little bit about how to study the Bible. So I want to start with a little bit about how we talk about the Old Testament text. There are 4 primary categories to the Old Testament. There are other ways to divide it up. I'm not saying this is the only way to look at it, but I'm going to talk about this particular paradigm. I think it will help us learn how to approach not only the book of Jonah, but other texts that we find ourselves in as well. The first is the law, okay, the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and we approach that like law, okay? It is the law. It's a spiritual law. It's a law for the people of God, but we would approach that mostly like we would approach a legal text. A second category is history. There are history books throughout the Old Testament that simply document things that have taken place. It simply document in the form of a narrative, this is what happened. And these history books are like 1st and 2nd Samuel or Joshua. These are books that tell us a story about something that took place in history. A third category is the prophets. Okay, we have minor prophets and we have major prophets. This just refers to how long the books are, right? The minor prophets are shorter, the major prophets are longer. That's all there is to that. Prophecies do two things in particular. They provide warnings and they provide teachings. Warnings and teachings. That's what we're looking for when we're reading the prophets most of the time. And the last category that I'll reference tonight is the wisdom literature, or these are maybe the writings, if you will. So this would be like Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon and Proverbs and Psalms, okay? This is one way to divide up the Old Testament. Well, the reason why this is important is because one of the first questions we should ask whenever we approach the biblical text is, what genre is this particular text in? But what genre is it in? Because if we don't answer that question, we might treat a prophetic book like a history book, or a history book like a wisdom literature book, or a wisdom literature book like a book of the law. And we wouldn't approach those things the same way, right? An example would be, we're reading the Chronicles of Narnia with our 9-year-old right now, which is a fantastic series, right? There's like brilliant storytelling and great character development. And it's just like so fun to read, even for an adult. And I've really, really enjoyed reading through it. You would read the Chronicles of Narnia, and you might be able to identify things in that story, in fact, probably a lot of things, that are true to humanity, okay? True things, like things you would read in there and be like, yeah, that seems to be true about how people interact with each other, or maybe siblings interact with each other, or how people in power hold that over people who are not in power. There's a variety of things that you could find in that series. But nobody in this room is going to read the Chronicles of Narnia like a history book, right? You're not going to do that. That wouldn't make any sense. That would be a very weird history if that's what you're reading into the world, reading into your experience. But there's all kinds of great stuff in there that certainly is true about history, right? So you approach different genres of literature in different ways, okay? So when we approach the book of Jonah, we have to approach it like prophecy, not like we would approach maybe the law or the wisdom literature. We're going to approach it differently. It's important as we look through this text in Jonah chapter 2 in particular, we're going to look for different things. Two primary things we look for when we're reading prophetic books is something I mentioned a second ago. The first question we're going to ask is there a warning in here that I need to pay attention to? Some sort of warning of some kind about me or someone else that I should pay attention to. Second thing is there a teaching, some sort of didactic, like this is what you should do or not do? Is that something that I'm looking for as well? Here's the problem with the book of Jonah. We see almost none of that in the book of Jonah. It is a very weird prophetic book. It doesn't follow the rules of the other prophetic books. The other books of prophecy, other than Jonah, follow these rules. They give us lots of warnings. They give us lots of teaching. The piece of teaching in the book of Jonah is so microscopic, you might not even notice it when we get to it. It hasn't come about yet in the story as we've been going along. If I don't point it out to you later on in the series, you might not even notice it. It's so minor. And that's kind of the point, by the way, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But it's such a minor piece that we have to be looking for something else. There aren't any warnings, really. There aren't any teachings. And so what are we looking for in Jonah? Well, what we end up doing is we start to look for a subgenre. That's a really helpful thing when you're reading a text and it doesn't follow the normal rules. You go, what's the subgenre? Well, the subgenre, as I've mentioned before, it's written very much like a comedy, okay? Now, when I say comedy, let me be very clear. Let's not think about modern American cinema, okay? It is nothing like a comedy that you would go see in a theater. Those are flippant and slapstick and silly and pretty easy to do without, right? I don't mean to downplay the significance of the book of Jonah. Rather, when I say comedy, what I mean is like a Jewish comedy or a Greek comedy, a very, very old comedy. It follows that structure. A lot of unexpected twists and turns. A lot of absurd, bizarre, completely unbelievable scenarios that draws the audience in and may even be comical at different times. But there is no doubt in my mind that the book of Jonah has weight. It has gravity, right? It's not flippant. It's not silly. It's very important. So when I say it's written like a comedy in its subgenre, that's the sort of structure that I'm talking about. The reason why it's important that we get to that point is so that we can actually look for the things that are actually there in the book of Jonah. We can't look for these warnings and these teachings because they're not there, but what we can look for and what is there is a tremendous amount of symbolism. A tremendous amount of symbolism, and we're going to see that as we go through just chapter 2, but it's really all over the book. I think there are 4 major symbols in Jonah chapter 2 that are worth our attention. And we need to think about these things as symbols. This is what I see. I see the 4 major symbols as being water, fish, prayer, and vomit. Water, fish, prayer, and vomit. I think this is like going to be a sequel to Eat, Pray, Love, right? I think this could. I'm going to contact the author and see if she's interested. We're going to go through these one by one really quickly. The first is water. What is the symbolism of water, particularly in Jonah chapter 2? Water in Jonah chapter 2 and really throughout the entire Bible equals death. It was the scariest, most unknown, most unforeseen thing in the ancient world. And if we're honest, it's still the scariest thing. Have you ever been to the ocean? Like being in the water and there's like a mile of water beneath you? That's a very scary thing. Or at the very least, it's unknown and overwhelming, right? You may not actually be afraid of the ocean, but we can all understand the maybe concern one would feel, especially with very little knowledge of the ocean, about what that would maybe mean for somebody who was on the ocean. Water equals death. There's something really subtle. There's 2 really subtle things actually in this text that have really changed the way it jumps off the page to me. And I'm going to fill you in on what I think these are. I think it really helps us understand Jonah chapter 2, and particularly water as death, and it helps us understand the fish really well. These subtle things can be really, really helpful. Have you ever read a book or watched a movie where you get this little bit of information at the very end that changes the way the entire story unfolds, and the only thing you can think about at the end of that movie is watching it again? Because you're like, now that I know this, I want to watch the whole thing again. Like the movie was okay, it was like pretty good, I guess, or whatever, and now I learned this, and now the whole thing has changed, and I want to go back and experience it again, right? Quintessential example of this is The Sixth Sense. You've seen this movie, perhaps. It's been out for 20 years, literally, and so I don't feel bad if I spoil this for you. I'm going to give you plenty of runway, so if you need to leave at some time, or if you're listening to the podcast, hit the 30-second fast-forward button. The Sixth Sense, great development, great plot development, great character development. As you're going through the movie the first time, you're like, this is pretty good. Like, I'm enjoying the storyline, pretty interesting premise, kid can see dead people, Bruce Willis seems to be a great therapist, maybe I want to talk to him, seems like a great thing, right? You're going throughout the whole movie, you get to the end, and you find out, bump, Bruce Willis has been dead the whole time. What? Yeah, sorry. Not really, though, because he's got 20 years, okay? So, crazy turn of events at the end of the movie. And all you can think about is, I can't wait to watch this thing again, right? Like, I want to watch this all over again. And most of us have watched it a second time if we've seen it because we wanted to see it again knowing that information. Similarly, when we catch something that I think changes the way a text jumps off the page to us, we just kind of want to keep reading it. So I've read through chapter 2 a couple times now that I know this about it. The first thing that you'll notice as you're reading through this prayer that Jonah prays is that it's almost all in the past tense. It's almost all in the past tense. Which is odd, because if you were in the belly of a fish, it would be all present tense. God, help me now. God, this is not good. God, I'm afraid. This is slimy. This is whatever. Like, I'm uncomfortable. You'd be praying about the present tense. Everything is past tense. Very interesting that everything he's saying is about please, or you did deliver me from the thing that I was experiencing. Second thing you'll notice is that this prayer is almost all thanksgiving and praise. It's almost all gratitude and adoration, to use some of the language that we used in our prayer series. If you and I were in the belly of a fish, it would be all petition, all supplication, all begging, it would be like, please help me right now. I need this right now. He said, no, God, you already did help me, and I'm thanking you for that. The reason why is because the fish doesn't represent death. The fish is not what Jonah's afraid of. The water is death. The water was death. And God uses the fish in the story to save Jonah, which is absolutely wild. What a bizarre... If you're reading this story for the first time, let's say you're a Jewish child, and this is maybe 1,000 years ago, and your parents are telling you this story. What a strange turn of events. Jonah was in the water, certain death, and guess what comes to save him? A huge fish. Swallows him whole. The fish in this story represents grace. It's not the fear of death. The fish does not represent the end, doom and gloom. To me, the fish, for my entire upbringing, was the punishment, right? Like, you didn't do what God asked you to do, and so he sent the fish to punish you, because 3 days in the belly of a fish must have been absolutely terrible, right? That was my assumption. But in reality, when we see the way Jonah phrases this prayer, we find that the fish itself is grace. An unusual, weird, bizarre, unexpected grace, which is oftentimes the way God extends grace to us, isn't it? If we think about some of the ways we've experienced God's grace through our life, we've experienced salvation in our life, things that God has saved us from, very strange ways in which that has happened in many cases. Very odd ways that God has extended his grace to us. Not least of which is the way that he sent his son to us to extend grace to the whole world. Jesus is a very odd way to extend grace to the world. A very beautiful way, but a poor migrant carpenter extending grace to the whole world on behalf of Yahweh is bizarre. It's almost like sending a whale to save somebody who's drowning in the sea. It's strange, but it's perfectly beautiful, and it fits beautifully into this story. Fourth, prayer. Prayer is an interesting database in this story. If you're reading this in an actual physical Bible, maybe like three of you, or if you're looking maybe even at a particular Bible app, you'll see that the prayer is written in these short stanzas. Okay, so short lines that don't take up the whole screen or the whole page. They're short and they're kind of choppy in the way that they are laid out. Where else in the Bible do we see this format? In the Psalms, right? We see those in the Psalms. We see them in the wisdom literatures because that is typically how poetry, Hebrew poetry, was written. Almost every single one of these lines can be attributed to a different psalm. You see, Jonah reflects on his Hebrew psalm book when he's in the belly of the fish. Have you ever been in a moment of crisis or a moment of depression or a moment of fear and been able to be creative also in that moment? It's a pretty tricky thing. Some people can do it, not a lot of people can. It's one of the first parts of our brain to shut down, our ability to be creative when we're in a situation where things are scary or difficult or unknown. We go into survival mode, and creativity is hard to come by, which is why a liturgy becomes really, really important. To have a database to pull from, to have an experience to pull from. It's why we've encouraged you, when you experience something that's awful, terrible, something worth lamenting, we encourage you to simply say the prayer, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. Keep that one in your back pocket. I heard someone from our church recently, when they were describing what our church is about, they said, we want to be generous because our Father is generous, and we want to show the world what he is like. That's a line pulled straight out of our generosity prayer that we've been saying every single week together for 3 years now. There's a bunch of different lines that we use in our prayers and in our teaching and in our songs that are so repeated that they are things you can sort of keep with you. They are liturgies, a database that you can pull from in whatever experience you happen to be in. I think the prayer here is a symbol for us to remind us that we don't always have to have the original, creative, perfect thing to say, but rather we can borrow and steal and take from the things that we already know. That's a good reminder for us. Lastly, vomit. The fish vomits Jonah onto the shore. Now, the word here is vomit. It's not spit. I mean, I think it was like changed at different times when I was a kid because we didn't want to talk too much about vomit. And I don't want to talk too much about it tonight. But I will tell you this. We've had a lot of kids come through our home over the past 6 or 7 years. And I think all of them at some time have vomited, okay? And we've cleaned that up. Obviously, that's what parents do. But it's one thing to experience that yourself, and it's one thing to watch somebody else go through that, right? Imagine being on the shore, and a fish surfaces, and you see that fish, not like Jonah swims out and like kind of like doggy paddles to the shore. The imagery here is like projectile from the fish onto the shore, okay? That's the imagery we're supposed to get here. That's why the word vomit is chosen. This isn't a mild experience. This is a fairly violent experience. He shoots through the air, potentially, I don't know, lands on the shore. Imagine watching that. That would be an incredible thing to watch. Imagine also being a part of that. So being Jonah, for instance, and experiencing that. What happens right after that, in that situation, is Jonah kind of comes to his senses. It may have happened in the fish. It may have happened out of the fish, but we see a little bit of dialogue at the beginning of chapter 3 between God and Jonah kind of goes, fine. I'll do what you asked me to do. God resends him. God recommissions him to go out and do the thing that he was originally called to do. The vomiting back onto the shore is a recommissioning. The reason why that's important is because when you and I read this story, especially in the way that I used to be taught to me, I would feel a lot of like guilt and shame and pressure that like I had somehow maybe missed God's calling. Like, what if God had been calling me to go do something that I didn't want to do, and I had been disobedient, whether intentionally or unintentionally, and in doing that, I had missed the thing that he had called me to do? Well, this scene here where he vomits Jonah back onto the shore actually gives me a lot of hope, because it means that God will recommission us. He will resend us. It doesn't mean that if we missed something the first time, or if we were disobedient the first time, that we don't get a second chance at that. Sometimes God calls us to something and we are resistant for whatever reason, and he gives us another opportunity to go after that thing. That, to me, is what the vomit symbolizes, is a recommissioning of Jonah, a resending to go and do the thing that he originally sent him to do. See, this is why I love the Bible so much. It continues to unfold more and more over time. I'll read Jonah again next year or the year after that, and I'll find out new stuff. And there'll be new things, new ways that it has impacted me. But I think for you and I, the discipline of continuing to go back to the text and saying, God, what is it that you have for me here now? What is the thing that you have for us to understand? The thing that I want to remind you about while we're in this series of Jonah is that this book is not about obligation. This book is not about punishment for disobedience like I thought it was. Rather, this book is about the overwhelming, unexpected, aggressive grace of God, going after every single person in the story, even the most unexpected, even the most undeserving people in the story, get God's grace. Jonah gets it in the weirdest way possible, at the weirdest timing. It's the strangest part of the story, but it's also so beautiful because it reminds us that God's grace does not come to us in conventional ways. God's grace does not come to us in the ways that we expect all the time, which should leave us turning over every rock and looking around every corner for it. Because I think it's always there, and it's just a matter of being able to experience it and remembering it. Tim Keller writes this about God's grace, particularly in the book of Jonah. He said, God is both too holy and too loving to either destroy Jonah or to allow Jonah to remain as he is. And God is also too holy and too loving to allow us to remain as we are. Anne Lamott put it this way: grace will find you exactly where you are, but it won't leave you where it found you. We say on occasion here, they say it every week at TNL, that you're accepted here just as you are. But there's a bit of subtext in that, because when I say that, you're accepted here just as you are, what I also want to say right after that, and you're invited to not stay that way. Not because I don't like you the way you are, I like you very much, but what I mean is you are invited to grow. You're invited to change. You're invited to experience the grace of God in such a way that you continue to move down a particular path. If we keep gathering here on Sunday evening and we don't encounter the grace of God in such a way that it changes us and we just kind of keep spinning our wheels, then we should probably stop doing this, right? This whole church thing doesn't make a lot of sense unless we're making progress, unless we're growing in a particular direction. That doesn't mean we won't have hard times. It doesn't mean we won't go backwards sometimes. It doesn't mean we won't get stalled out. But my hope is that overall for you, as you continue to encounter the grace of God, that it will not leave you as it found you, but rather it will continue to recommission you and sending you out over and over and over again. Rescue, salvation, growth, change, progress, health, these are all available through God's grace. So in the symbolism of the story, what do you need to be saved from? What is the thing in your life that you need rescue from? I think the water in Jonah obviously symbolizes the thing that means certain death. What is the thing in your life that you must be saved from? What could possibly save you? Like, what is the thing that could possibly dig you out of that situation? I believe it's God's grace. It's clear in this story. And by what means? Well, if I were you, I would keep my eyes peeled, because salvation does not always come in the ways that we expected. God's grace does not always come to us in the ways that we would anticipate. Our friend Anne says this about grace: to summon grace, say help and buckle up. To summon grace, say help and buckle up. Because the way in which it comes to you might be the strangest way you can imagine. The way in which it comes to you might be exactly what you need, but you never expected it, and you certainly didn't ask for it. I don't know how grace is going to come to you, but I believe that it is something that can come for you, and it can change you. It can shape you. There's plenty of grace to come in the next few weeks. That's really what we're going to be talking about for the entirety of the book of Jonah. And I'm looking forward to discovering that with you in the coming weeks. But for now, let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for an opportunity to dig into this text that I thought I knew all about for so long. And yet, as I've continued to dig, I've learned so much about who you are and who I am, and what happens when you and I collide. And I pray, God, that you would continue to show us that really in those interactions, the primary thing that is extended to us is grace. And I pray, God, that tonight as we wrap things up, that you would send us out with grace and in grace, and that we would then extend that to the people around us. We pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.